Brother, when your jets turned toward my land, I did not see an enemy. I saw a hand being guided from far away. I am not here to fight you. I am here to remind you. We were never meant to stand on opposite sides.
What does it feel like when a brother turns toward you? Not with open arms, but with a weapon. Not an enemy, not a stranger, but someone who shares your history, your pain, your past. This is what made the situation between Chad and Burkina Faso so powerful and emotional. When Chad sent its combat jets toward Burkina Faso's northern border, it wasn't just a military move. It felt like a betrayal of something deeper. These are nations shaped by the same colonial wounds, the same struggles for dignity, the same fight to stand on their own feet. That's why this moment hit differently across Africa. It wasn't about borders or power alone. It was about identity. People began asking, how does a brother become a threat? And the answer wasn't simple. It wasn't hatred, and it wasn't history between the two countries. It was something much bigger, something that has been quietly shaping decisions across the continent for decades. What the world saw was not just jets in the sky, but a painful reminder that sometimes the real conflict is not between nations, but within them. To understand why Chad made that move, you have to look beyond Africa and toward France. France's role in this story is not new, but it is powerful. For years, Chad has depended on France for military support and political stability. There have been moments in Chad's history where the government might not have survived without French intervention. And when a country knows that its survival has depended on another, that creates a kind of pressure that is hard to explain, but even harder to resist. So when France came with a request, it didn't feel like a simple suggestion. It felt like an expectation. The request was carefully packaged in the language of regional stability and security. But the real goal was clear: disrupt Burkina Faso's supply routes, especially those connected to growing partnerships with Russia. Chad was chosen not because it wanted conflict, but because it was in a position where saying no carried risks that were simply too high. This is how influence works, not always through force, but through dependence that has been built over time. But what makes this story even more surprising is what Burkina Faso already knew before the jets even took off under the leadership of Ibrahim Traoré. The country's intelligence system had been quietly tracking the situation for weeks. Conversations, plans, movements, enough pieces of the puzzle were gathered to understand what was coming. And instead of reacting with panic or aggression, they responded with strategy. The supply routes that were supposed to be targeted were quietly changed. Equipment was moved through alternative paths that had already been prepared for situations like this. By the time Chad's jets were in the air, heading toward their mission, the reality on the ground had already shifted. What they were flying toward no longer existed in the way they had been told. It was a silent move, almost invisible, but incredibly powerful. This wasn't about confrontation. It was about control, about staying one step ahead without making noise. When the jets finally reached the operational area, something unexpected happened. They realized they were not alone, not unseen. Burkina Faso's air defense systems had been tracking them from the moment they took off. Every movement, every signal, every detail was being watched with precision. The pilots could see it on their systems. This was not a weak or unprepared defense. This was something advanced, something they had not been fully briefed about. And yet, even in that moment of complete control, Ibrahim Traoré made a choice that changed everything. He ordered his forces not to fire unless absolutely necessary. He did not want war with Chad. He did not want African blood spilled over a decision influenced from outside. So, the jets turned back. No missiles, no explosions, just silence and realization. But what came next was even more powerful than any military response. A phone call, not through diplomats, not through statements, but directly leader to leader. And in that call, the real message was delivered, not through weapons, but through truth. That phone call was where everything truly changed. Ibrahim Traoré didn't begin with anger, even though he had every reason to be furious. Instead, he began with history. He reminded Chad's president of the past. They both shared the years of colonial control, the decisions made for them by outsiders, the systems that kept African nations dependent long after independence was declared. He spoke calmly, almost like an older brother trying to make someone understand a mistake rather than punish it. He made it clear that he understood the pressure Chad was under, that he knew this decision wasn't born out of hatred or ambition. And then he asked a simple but powerful question: do you understand what you just did? That question wasn't about military action. It was about identity, about responsibility. He explained that by flying those jets, Chad wasn't just following orders, it was being used as a tool against another African nation. And in that moment, the conversation stopped being political. It became deeply personal. Then came the part that carried weight far beyond the moment. Traoré revealed that he had everything: the flight data, the communication records, even details of the conversations between France and Chad's military. This wasn't a guess or an accusation. It was proof. But what made it powerful wasn't the information itself. It was what he chose to do with it. He said clearly that he had decided not to release any of it. Not yet. He wasn't calling to threaten. He was calling to give a choice. But at the same time, he made the consequences impossible to ignore. If this happened again, everything would be made public, every detail, every hidden agreement, every moment where pressure was applied behind closed doors. It was a warning, but it didn't feel like one delivered in anger. It felt controlled, precise, almost surgical, the kind of warning that doesn't need to be repeated because it lands exactly where it's supposed to. In that moment, the powers shifted, not through force, but through truth held back. On the other side of the line, Chad's president was left in silence. And that silence said more than any response could. He wasn't just thinking about the failed mission, he was thinking about what it meant. He now knew that Burkina Faso was not only prepared militarily, but also deeply informed. He knew that the story of his country's relationship with France, a story that had stayed mostly behind closed doors, could be exposed in a way that would change everything. But more than that, he was sitting with the way Traoré had spoken to him, not as an enemy, not as someone to be destroyed, but as a brother who still had the chance to choose differently. That kind of conversation is rare in politics, where most communication is hidden behind formal language and distance. This was direct, honest, and impossible to ignore. It forced a different kind of reflection, one that goes beyond strategy and into something more human. For the first time, the decision wasn't just about pressure from outside. It was about responsibility from within. As the news of this situation spread across Africa, people didn't focus only on the jets or the military side of things. What captured attention the most was that phone call, the courage to speak directly, to say something real without hiding behind diplomatic words. Across the continent, many saw this as a new kind of leadership, one that doesn't just react, but understands, one that doesn't rush to destroy but chooses carefully when to act. Government stayed silent. France said nothing as if the mission had never happened. Chad also remained quiet, but its silence felt different. It felt like a country thinking, reconsidering, processing something bigger than a single event. And Burkina Faso gave just one simple statement confirming that everything was under control. No drama, no noise, because the real message had already been delivered privately, exactly where it needed to go. And sometimes the strongest move is not the one the world sees, but the one that changes what happens next. What made this moment even more powerful was what didn't happen afterward. There was no victory speech, no public exposure, no attempt to embarrass Chad on the global stage. Ibrahim Traoré chose silence, and that silence carried weight. In a world where leaders rush to control the narrative, he stepped back and allowed the situation to breathe. Only one short statement came out from Burkina Faso, simply saying that the country's security and supply lines remained intact. That was it, no details, no accusations. Because this time the goal wasn't to prove strength to the world, it was to create space for a decision to be made behind the scenes. It showed a different kind of confidence, the kind that doesn't need validation. Sometimes saying less forces others to think more. And in that quiet space, something important was happening. Pressure was no longer coming from just one direction.
Now it was balanced by awareness, by truth, and by the possibility of exposure. Meanwhile, the silence from France told its own story. When a country that usually shapes global narratives suddenly says nothing, it means something didn't go as planned. There was no official statement, no explanation, no attempt to frame the situation in a different light, because there was no version of this story that could be told without revealing the failure behind it. The mission didn't succeed, the target wasn't hit, and the message that was supposed to be sent never reached its destination. Instead, the opposite happened. The event quietly exposed a growing reality that influence built over decades can still exist, but it no longer guarantees control. Across Africa, observers began to connect the dots. This wasn't just about one mission, it was part of a larger shift where countries were slowly beginning to question the structures that had guided their decisions for years. And when that questioning begins, even quietly, it changes everything over time. Back in Chad, the real impact of that phone call was still unfolding. There were no public statements, no visible reactions, but inside the leadership, something had clearly shifted. The president now had to think beyond immediate pressure. He had to consider what the next request from France would look like and what it would cost, not just politically, but in terms of trust across Africa. Because now the situation was different. Before, decisions could be made quietly with limited consequences beyond strategy. But now there was awareness that those decisions could be seen, understood, and even revealed. That changes how leaders think. It adds a new layer to every choice. And perhaps more importantly, it introduces doubt about whether following the same path again is worth the risk. This is how real change begins, not always with loud declarations, but with quiet reconsideration behind closed doors. In the end, this entire situation was never just about jets, borders, or military plans. It was about something deeper, the kind of Africa that is being shaped right now. One path continues the old pattern where external powers influence decisions and African nations are pushed into positions that don't always serve their people. The other path is harder, more uncertain, but more independent, where decisions are made with a clear understanding of who benefits and who pays the price. Ibrahim Traoré didn't just stop a mission, he presented a choice, not through force, but through clarity. And somewhere in N'Djamena, that choice is still sitting on the table. Because in the end, the real question isn't what happened that day. The real question is what happens the next time pressure comes, and whether that pressure will be followed or finally resisted.